If you're a parent in Minnesota, you've probably seen them. Those emails and letters with a bunch of acronyms, MCA, MTAS, WIDA. It can feel like a real alphabet soup. So today, we're going to break down Minnesota's school testing system and figure out what it all really means for your child. Let's dive in.
You know, it's totally normal to feel a little confused, maybe even a bit anxious when all these test names start flying around. What are they? Which ones does my kid take? And, maybe most importantly, why should I even care? Well, don't worry. We're going to answer all of those questions and get you some real clarity.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll get the big picture of the testing landscape. Then we'll zero in on the main tests, the MCA. After that, we'll cover the alternate and language tests, get into the when and how of it all, talk about why these tests actually matter, and then we'll wrap it all up with a super handy checklist for 2026.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Why do we even have all these tests in the first place? Well, it really boils down to one main goal: to see how well students across the state are learning what they're supposed to be learning, based on Minnesota's official academic standards.
And that's what these are. They're called statewide assessments. The whole idea is to have a consistent way to check in on student progress, whether they're in the Twin Cities or up on the Iron Range. It's how the state meets federal rules, and for your kid, it usually just means taking a test on a computer during a normal school day in the spring.
All right, let's talk about the big one, the test that most families have definitely heard of, the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments. Yep, we're talking about the MCAs.
Now, the key thing to get right away is that kids don't take every MCA every single year. As you can see here, the reading test is for grades 3 through 8, and then again in 10th grade. Math is pretty similar. It's grades 3 through 8, and then one more time in 11th grade. In science, that happens just 3 times, in 5th grade, 8th grade, and then once during high school.
But the MCA, even though it's the main test, isn't the whole story. Minnesota has some other really important assessments that are designed for students with very specific needs. It's not a one-size-fits-all system.
So for students who have the most significant cognitive disabilities, there's a different path. If a student's learning plan shows they meet some very specific criteria, they might take what's called the MTAS or the alternate MCA. And it's so important to understand this. This is not an easier test. It's a different test, one that's designed to give a much more accurate and accessible picture of what that student knows and can do.
Then we have another really important group of students, our English learners. The vast majority of them will take something called the WIDA Access Test. This test has nothing to do with math or science. Its only job is to measure how well a student is progressing in learning the English language. It's a completely separate thing from the MCAs. And just like with the academic tests, there's an alternate version for students who qualify.
Okay, so we know the what and the why. Let's get practical. How does this all actually work? When do these tests happen? And what do schools do to get students ready for them?
Here's a quick look at the 2026 statewide testing windows. As you can see, those English language tests, the WIDA, they happen pretty early in the year. Then, starting in March, the window opens up for all the academic tests, the MCAs and their alternates. That window stays open all the way into early May, which gives schools a lot of flexibility to get the testing done.
Now, this is a really critical point. The state sets that big window of time, but your local school district picks the exact days your child will actually sit down and take the test. So, the schedule in one town could be totally different from the one next door. What's the bottom line? You have to confirm the specific test dates with your child's school.
And what about getting ready? Are kids just thrown in cold? Absolutely not. Schools are required to help students get comfortable with the test itself. They have these readiness tools so kids can practice with the online format, learn how to use the built-in calculator, or see how to highlight text. The whole point is to make sure that technology isn't part of the test.
Okay, this brings us to the big one. The question that I know can cause a lot of stress and concern for families. Why do these tests matter? What are the actual stakes here?
And that usually leads to this question, probably the single biggest worry on the mind of every parent with a high schooler. Does my kid have to pass these tests to graduate?
And the answer is a very clear, very direct, and hopefully very reassuring no. Let me say that one more time, just so it sinks in. Statewide tests like the MCAs are not a graduation requirement in the state of Minnesota.
So if they're not for graduation, what are they for? Well, think of them less as a test for your child and more as a checkup for the school.
The results give us information on student progress. They help us measure how our schools are doing, and they shine a big spotlight on where more support or resources might be needed. They help adults make better decisions about teaching. They don't decide a student's future.
Okay, we've gone through a lot of info. So let's pull it all together right now with a simple, actionable checklist you can use to feel totally prepared.
Here it is, your 2026 checklist. First, know exactly which tests your child is scheduled to take. Is it the MCA, MTAS, WIDA? Next, confirm your school's exact testing dates. Then, don't be afraid to ask about those readiness tools or any accommodations your child might be eligible for. And please remember the big one. These tests are about progress, not graduation. The best thing you can do is stay informed and ask your questions early.
We've covered a ton of ground here, from the big picture all the way down to the nitty-gritty details. So to keep this momentum going, I'll leave you with this final thought. Based on everything we just talked about, what's the one question you're going to ask your child's school this testing season? Because being an informed and proactive parent, well, that's your superpower.